Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex Brubaker. I'm the manager here at the Scholar. And as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the bookstore. Whether you're joining us on Crowdcast or Facebook Live or even YouTube Live, hope you're safe. Hope you're hanging in there. Thanks so much for tuning in. I love all the familiar names I'm starting to see in our event room. The more times we do this, Jess, Barbara, Cher, Kathy, Maureen, Scott, Pam, just to name a few. I know there's a bunch other of you out there. It really means so much to have you here with us, celebrating some of our favorite new books with some of our favorite authors. At this time, I'd like to encourage you, if you have the means, to purchase Amy Jo's new book. If you haven't yet done so, purchasing her book through us helps support the author, our staff, this event series, and of course, you get one of my personal favorite novels of the year out of it. We're offering free media mail shipping in the US to make the price more reasonable. So if you click the green button below, it will direct you. It's just right below my face here. It'll direct you to our website to purchase a new copy of Amy Jo's book. Now, if you purchase the book through us, we'll also throw in a signed book plate. Here we go. Amy Jo was very kind enough to send those on to us. And we also have a free bookmark that will include handcrafted by Amy Jo herself. So if you're watching this through Facebook Live or YouTube Live, look in the comment section and you should see we've provided a link there as well, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. And thank you everyone for your support. Now, this evening, we are super excited to welcome authors Amy Jo Burns and Christina Baker Kline to virtual Harrisburg. Our interviewer this evening is, of course, Christina Baker Kline. She is a #1 New York Times bestselling author of 8 novels, including The Exiles, Orphan Train, and A Piece of the World. She is published in 40 countries. Her novels have received the New England Prize for Fiction, the Maine Literary Award, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Award, among other prizes, and have been chosen by hundreds of communities, universities, and schools as one book, one read selections. Her essays, articles, and reviews have appeared in publications such as the New York Times and the New York Times Book Review, the Boston Globe, the San Francisco Chronicle, LitHub, Psychology Today, and Salon. And I have to give just a quick plug to Christina's new novel, which is coming out in September. It's titled The Exiles, and it's been teased as an epic tale of Australia's complex history. That's all I'm going to tell you. I have not read it yet, but Christina, I can assure you that I'll be following up with your publisher and hounding them for an advance copy when they're ready, because I can't wait for it. Again, The Exiles coming out in September. Of course, our author this evening is the wonderful Amy Jo Burns. She is the author of the memoir Cinderland. Her writing has appeared in the Paris Review Daily, Tin House, Plowshares, Gay Magazine, Electric Literature, Literary Hub, and the anthology Not That Bad. You can find her on Twitter at Amy Jo Burns. Her debut novel, which we are here for this evening, is titled Shiner. Here it is. Beautiful cover. It's been called Raw and Honest by the New York Times as of today. And best-selling author Joshua Jackson called it Simply Perfect. Now, one quick note before I hand it over to Amy and Christina. We think the best part about these events is audience interaction. So even though we're not in person, we still want you involved. If you have a question for Amy Jo or Christina, please use the Ask a Question button below. It's, again, below my face towards the middle of the screen. To submit your question. You can also upvote your favorite questions to make sure they get asked. So get those questions in. But now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming onto the screen Christina Baker Kline and Amy Jo Burns.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone. We're so happy to be here, aren't we, Amy Jo?
Oh my goodness, been looking forward to it all week.
I know. I have too, because I love this book.
Thank you.
And so I'm Christina, obviously. This is Amy Jo. And I was lucky enough to read an early copy of this book and blurb it before any of you got to see it. And I knew at the time that Amy Jo was a singular talent. We were both sort of mentored, I would say, by an incredible writer named Louise DeSalvo. And in fact, her daughter-in-law, Deb, I think is here.
Hi, Deb.
But Louise ran the creative nonfiction program at Hunter College for years. And my favorite book of hers is Crazy in the Kitchen, but she has many great books. But so Amy Jo and I had that connection to begin with. And I'll get back to that because I'd love for you to talk a little bit about having been mentored. And
I would love to talk about it.
As an introduction to this amazing book, I thought maybe we should start by asking you to read a page.
If you don't mind. Yeah, sure. I sure will. So I'm going to read from the prologue, which is titled True Story. Making good moonshine isn't that different from telling a good story, and no one tells a story like a woman. She knows that legends and liquor are best spun from the back of a pickup truck after nightfall, just as she knows to tell a story slowly, the way whiskey drips through a sieve. Moonshine earned its name from spending its life concealed in the dark, and no one understands that fate more than I do. Beyond these hills, my people are known for the kick in their liquor and the poverty in their hearts. Overdoses, opioid, unemployment. Folks prefer us this way, dumb-mouthed with yellow teeth and cigarettes, dumb-minded with carboys of whiskey and broken-back Bibles. But that's not the real story. Here's what hides behind the beauty line along West Virginia's highways, a fear that God has forgotten us. We live in the wasteland that coal has built, where trains eat miles of track. Our men slip serpents through their fingers on Sunday mornings and pray for God to show himself, while our wives wash their husbands' underpants. Here's what hides behind my beauty line. My father wasn't just one of these men. He was the best. Stop.
Wow. I think you get such a great sense of the tenor of the book and the way it that the language informs the narrative so beautifully with that.
Oh.
Amy Jo. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll talk more about your prose and your language in a minute, but I wanted to start by acknowledging that here we are. You're on, the book tour for your debut novel, and instead, here you're at home talking to us from, I guess, a room with a bookcase, as I am too. And I was wondering, what has this experience been like for you? This was supposed to be you were supposed to be on tour.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I was writing the book, something that kind of helped me keep going. When I was writing the book, I was a mother of 2 young kids, and I still am, obviously, a mother of 2 young kids. And it just was, this experience as a mom where you feel like you're giving so much of yourself and you're emptying yourself out, every day continually for these little beings that you love. And in the back of my head, I kept saying to myself, there is going to be a time when your novel will come out and you're going to get to talk about the books that you love and meet people and do all those things. And, when I realized that it wasn't going to look like how I'd hoped, it was a little crushing, to be honest, because I just, because it had been that thing that I was sort of holding on to, me feeling like I'm going to be a person again, But what has been really interesting and encouraging is I think even, I'm in my bedroom right now, and I mean, full disclosure, my door's locked because there's 2 little ones who are very excited in the house. But
how old are they, by the way?
They're 2 and 5. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I still have been able to do all those things that I was hoping to do. I've been able to meet new people. I've been able to read wonderful books. I've been able to, talk about this book that I wrote that I loved. So in one sense, it was kind of encouraging to me that those things can coexist. I don't have to trade one for the other. I mean, I'm not saying I wouldn't change it, but I'm grateful that all these things have been made possible,
Right.
Yeah.
It all changed very quickly, and people have really adapted. I mean, look at these amazing
it's incredible
who are listening to you here. Any like unexpected surprises or kind of things that happened that were actually delightful?
You mean with the publication process?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So, you know what? One of the best things is, I'm curious if you feel this way too, but there was such a long time where no one had read the book that I sort of forgot that feeling that I get when I read a book that I love, that I might give that to a reader, So just hearing from, I got some emails over the weekend from people who either grew up in West Virginia or people who came across the book for whatever reason and how much it meant to them, especially in quarantine, so many people have said to me so far that my book was keeping them company. And that was so moving to me to know, because, I feel stuck and marooned. And so being able to hear from readers who really connected with it, there's no feeling like that in the world, to know that I wrote something and I worked so hard on it. And then to just know that it created a world within a world for somebody who's, living alone right now, which a lot of people are.
Oh, absolutely. And, it's such a strange thing to write books, because you're sitting in a room for so long and you kind of do forget that other people might actually get pleasure out of the words you put on the page.
And be surprised. Something, it's interesting. So many people have commented to me about the way that the book is structured and how that was sort of a surprise. And if you haven't read the book, there's 3 different narrators and it moves around kind of in time, sort of backward in time. And to me, my brain sort of naturally works that way. So it was really neat to hear people be surprised by something, because I love that as a reader too. When you're reading something, you go,
Yeah.
So it's really cool to
moments in your book where there are great surprises. It's one of the delights of reading it. It's very beautifully plotted. Okay, your book came out and it's been getting all kinds of great response and buzz. And in fact, today or yesterday, there was a review in the New York Times that you said on social media made you cry. So I wondered what that has been like for you.
You know what? I think it's so hard when you are sitting at your desk and you've got your notebook or your laptop out and you're trying to fix a sentence, or you're trying to fix a plot point or something like that. It's so hard to conceive of in the future that someplace like the New York Times would read it and enjoy it. I mean, especially when as you know, you get put through the paces when you're writing a book, and you're like really, looking at everything. So you forget that there's this other side of people reading it and connecting with it. And I will always feel a little strange reading about my book. It's kind of like listening to your voice on an answering machine. You're like, ugh, but I'm so glad that those things exist, because the book was written in isolation, but it's sort of appreciated among groups of readers or book clubs, which is interesting because it's a lot like Moonshine, which is in the book. It's sort of this thing that's this very solitary process, that's done in secret, but then it's shared among people. So
yeah, that's a very interesting connection to make. I thought it was interesting that the review today was for the audio version. I reviewed a book for them called The Tattooist of Auschwitz. I read the audio, and I was talking in the review, as the reviewer was today, about the effect of the voice. So many people are doing audiobooks these days, and I think a lot of people at home are doing audiobooks. And one of the things the reviewer talked about was how the reader that you had really captured the cadence of the language and of the voice. And I wondered if you had anything to do with that.
So I sent a very enthusiastic email to the producer of the audiobook about, I sent a playlist of all the songs I listened to when I wrote the book. And then I also sent a casting of who would play each role in my, dream film. And I tried to, one of the things I think that's difficult about casting Appalachia, whether it's on the page or in an audiobook or in a film, it's so easy to sort of fall into those stereotypes. So I tried to, explain, obviously the audiobook readers would understand this, but there's a difference between a Southern accent that's in West Virginia and then one that's in Florida or one that's in Texas. So I just mentioned, that there are some subtleties there, and they did, just did such an amazing job with it. So
they really did. Okay, so let's step back and talk about your book. Do you want to tell us what the book is about?
Sure, yeah. So Shiner tells the story of a 15-year-old girl. Her name is Wren, and she lives this really secluded life in the mountains of West Virginia with her parents. And her dad became a local legend when he got struck by lightning, and he became a preacher who takes up serpents. And one summer, Wren witnesses him perform this really strange miracle that goes horribly wrong. And then all of her family's secrets start to unravel. And so the book, as I mentioned before, it's told from three different voices. One is Wren's, another is a reclusive housewife, and the last is a lovelorn moonshiner. And those voices work together to tell the truth behind this mountain legend.
What a story. So tell us what inspired you to write it and what sort of background you have that brought you to this.
Yeah, so I grew up in northern Appalachia in western Pennsylvania. And, you know, this question is, I like answering it because each day I feel like I sort of pick a different piece because it's hard to tell when a book actually starts. But so I did grow up in western Pennsylvania, visited West Virginia as a teenager. And I think, and I grew up in a faith healing community when I was young, and it was never called that when I was a kid. It's one of those terms that's used by outsiders to kind of define you as a way you would never define yourself. And when I left Western Pennsylvania and I realized that there were these terms for this life that I'd lived that I didn't understand, I think even at the age of 18, when I left, that sort of started the creative process in my mind of what it might look like to tell the story of a family or people who feel misunderstood by the world around them and to feel that they've been given labels that don't fit by the outside world. So I think that was a piece that has been sitting with me since I was a teenager. But I think that the story itself really took on life for me after I had finished writing my memoir, which came out in 2014. And that book is, it's a serious book. It's about a sexual assault that happened in my hometown when I was young and how the young women who were the victims were not believed. And what that whole experience of publishing that book taught me is what it's like when a woman has a story that hasn't been heard. And I think I wanted to explore, that's explored in my memoir to some degree, but I really wanted to explore it in fiction as well. And so after I published my memoir and it just felt really exposed with my personal life and was sick of myself, there was a part of me that just wanted to hide. So I started just imagining this family that had made the choice to hide themselves away. And I just thought, what might it be like if someone who is hidden takes center stage, and what kind of story would they tell?
Yeah, it really comes through. It's funny that you mentioned the memoir because I was thinking in some ways about Educated, which is a memoir.
Oh, yeah. Yes, it is.
It's not unlike the sort of issues that your central character grapples with are not unlike the issues that she grapples with. And for you now to talk about your own background and how, in a way, you may not have had that kind of experience exactly, but you know, in your novel, you've got this charismatic, strong male character who really does dominate these females, and education for them is out of reach. And that's true of Educated as well, obviously. And it's only through sort of empowering herself that she's able to break free from that. Life isn't easy for anyone in Appalachian country, but it's particularly hard for women and girls. And that comes across so strongly in your book. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, like you said, it's something that came out in the memoir as well. So it was sort of churning in my mind. And I think women and men, not just in Appalachia, but anywhere, they don't play by the same rules, you know? And something that I wanted to get across in the book is that even when there's all the love in the world between two people, sometimes it's not enough to overcome that sort of power structure. And that power structure in some ways is the real villain in the book, because it affects the relationship between, you know, father and daughter, and between husband and wife. And this idea that, especially when you add the faith element into it, that men sort of maybe can lead better, or men can hear from God better, it ends up creating these men, like you said, who bet on the myth of themselves, and it puts their families in danger. And I wanted to create a kind of story that celebrated women women's legends instead of men. But what I didn't want to do was take sort of this, like, if I was going to write a book about moonshine, I didn't want to, take a woman and slap her on a man's body and have her be like, I'm this freewheeling girl who's out and I don't care about, whatever. I wanted to really take the female experience, the good and the bad, and say, let's make a legend of this. And what that I think means in the story is that it moves backward in time and it deals with trauma and how we carry that with us through life, and how there is something that is very mythic and very legendary and very powerful about that hasn't gotten its due, I think, in myths or legends or really regular narratives.
Well, and you've shown the bond between these women who understand each other's, situation in a way that no outsider could. And it's this very strong sense of community, in part because of the fragility of it and the fraught nature of it, which I think you've done so well. So I'd love to hear about the research you did. Did you actually spend time in snake handling communities? How did you learn all this?
Yeah, so I mean, a big part of why I wanted to write the book, as I mentioned, was that I have read a fair amount of novels that have tackled this idea of faith healing, and I never felt like they got it quite right. I mean, so I did not visit a snake handling church, but as I mentioned, I did grow up in a faith healing community, and I think one of the things that always got to me about that was people assume when you're an outsider that ambition for maybe a snake handling preacher means money. And that for me has never been true of the men that I knew. I mean, it wasn't that they weren't ambitious. They were. I just don't think they cared about money. They cared more about having God show up in some way. They cared about making something of lasting quality with their hands. So I wanted to write about people who had faith, who had ambition, but couldn't move. They're not going to move to some big city and make a lot of money. I wanted to show some different ways that mirrored, what I saw when I was growing up, the good and the bad, because there's both, So I did read a lot of wonderful books. Dennis Covington wrote a nonfiction account. It's called Salvation on Sand Mountain. I recommend that book to everyone. It's absolutely incredible. It's about a journalist, Covington, who covers a story in Alabama where a snake handling preacher gets convicted for attempted murder when his wife gets bitten by a snake. So when I read that, it was such a wonderful book that gives an example of like how there's this larger national narrative of the snake handler, but then underneath it, there's this woman who lived her whole life and she had dreams and hopes and longings, and the rest of the world sees her through her husband's sins and malfunctions. And I think that I thought that was really a tragedy, So that was one book I read. I also read a lot of oral histories, the Foxfire anthologies that they are wonderful. Those are also, it's all oral histories from all different kinds of parts of Appalachia. I mean, you can learn about, caning and making soap and planting by the signs and how to make a banjo. I mean, all those things. But what ended up happening that was so interesting was I was researching faith healing communities, and right up against it in all these books that I was reading were these accounts of moonshiners. And I came upon it completely by accident, but I just got so swept away in these stories, again, of people who just felt really misunderstood. These, craftsmen and these artists who dedicate their lives to this art form that, most of them were taught by their fathers. And to them, it's whiskey, but it's more than that. It's this sort of family bond and this string that ties generations together. And it's a cultural footprint. It's a way that they celebrate the land. And it was so beautiful to me that I just wanted to find a way to honor it in the novel. And I feel like it gave the novel a real backbone, because in the book, then you have this man who has this crazy snake faith, but then you also have this other man who's got this really grounded faith. He's not somebody who's ever going to go to church, but he's got a real faith in this process of how you take corn and water and you let it sit and it becomes this magical thing. So I was really excited to put that in the book, and I felt such a kinship with them because I mentioned, when I was writing the book, I was a new mom, and I had such bad insomnia, and I was up all night, it felt like, one summer when my son was born, and I was the only one awake in the house, and I just kept thinking of these moonshiners that were out in the hills doing their thing, and it helped me feel less lonely, I think. So it was so fun to research all that.
That is really fun and interesting. I mean, one of the wonderful things about the book is that, well, after I finished reading it, I went down this rabbit hole of, I think, documentaries and
yeah, there's a lot of good stuff.
Seeing what that world was like. And I was struck by how you captured the fervor of it so well without ever seeming like you were judging the culture. And I was wondering, how did you walk that fine line?
I think one of the things I set out to do when I wrote the book was that I wanted to make sure I was never trying to speak on behalf of an entire people group or anything like that. And I think that served me well to sort of feel like I didn't need to make a big statement about this way of life or anything like that. All I wanted to do was show someone who loves his land, who loves his family, and who loves, his trade. And that, I think, covers over a lot of the other things. We saying, well, no, he's not paying his taxes, and he's probably not voting in elections, and he might not be, the best husband or brother or whatever, but he loves making moonshine, and there's something that he's dedicated to it, so
right. Yeah. You see the passion.
Yes. And I think, anybody who reads these stories, you're just so taken with the sacrifice that these people give so willingly, and the communities come to depend on those people as well, even though they're maligned or misunderstood, Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to start taking questions.
Sure.
And we'll probably go another 15 minutes or so. So you said in an interview that our stories are lived in isolation, but gather meaning when they're shared. And I just wondered what you meant by that. How do they gather meaning for you?
I think that was in response to a question about women's untold stories, especially as they relate to mother and daughter. And that is something that I held so close to my heart when I was writing the book is, how can a mother tell her child or tell her daughter a really difficult story about maybe a time when she felt alone or a time when she made mistakes? And there's so much, I think, as a parent, you don't want your child to hurt and you want to keep your child safe, but there's also something really important that happens when a story is passed from parent to child. And I wanted to write a book where the story is passed, but we also see the struggle of passing it, because I think that becomes part of the story too, is that knowing how hard it is to share a difficult story. And maybe part of it is me thinking about telling some of my hard stories to my kids when they grow up. But I do think there's something, we write because we do want to share what we've learned, or what we did wrong, or what we miss with somebody. It all comes down to having that kind of communion and connection that you can't have in the moment. It's kind of in retrospect that you sort of understand something and then can pass it on to someone else. There's just so much rich history, I think, for women in general, and they've been silenced for so long. And there's such a loss in that. There's so much history that we don't know because women haven't really been allowed to talk about things. So as I said, I wanted to make sure those stories were kind of passed, but I also wanted to show why it's hard to pass them and why it makes sense. I mean, we keep secrets because we need protection from something, right?
Right.
But there comes a time when you do start to wrestle with, should I tell it? Should I not tell it? Is it better to keep it? Is it, so I wanted to give that struggle some honor on the page too.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And I have to ask a tiny follow-up, but
Yeah.
would you ever write another memoir, given all of that you just said?
You know what? I won't rule it out. I mean, never say never, because I think there is something really special about memoir writing and nonfiction writing that I think I won't say scratches an itch, but I think it does something for me internally that produces like some good fruit for me personally. I think memoir is a really sacred process that you sort of enter with fear and trembling. And I'm so glad that was my first book. I think it puts you at incredible risk, though, as a person. It leaves you very exposed.
Yeah, it's scary.
And, I think it's okay to question about whether something that you've written is just for you or whether it's fitting for an audience. So I will always be writing nonfiction. I don't know if it will ever end up in a book form, but I find that it is such a valuable way for me to process things that are happening, and I think be a better life partner and a better friend. But that doesn't always transfer into something that is helpful and readable for others. But if you had asked me after Cinderland came out, I would I'm never doing this again. Because I think that the risk and the cost of telling a true story is very high. And so, but now that it's been a few years, you never know. You never know.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. A little rest. Okay, so we have some great questions here. So I'm going to jump right in. This is from Mega. I'd love to ask a craft question about 3 voices in the book.
Yeah.
How did you write them? Go in and out of their voices and structure their arcs.
Yeah. So what a great question. I mean, when I started writing it, I didn't necessarily think there was going to be anybody beyond the first character, who's the 15-year-old girl named Wren. I think what I did was I would just work on one section, one voice at a time, and it was usually for months. And so I would just get so into that voice and make sure that section had an arc. And I actually think it worked out better for me, because one of the hard things, I think, is if every chapter is a new voice, that has its own challenge. So there was something really nice about like just being able to dig deep into one person and really see things through their eyes. And so I would just spend a lot of time. And then what worked out is that I would sort of move from one to the next to the next. And so I'd spend, say, 1 month on Wren. Then the next month I would move to Flynn, who's the moonshiner, then the last to Ivy, who's the housewife. And then by the time you get to the end, the beginning feels very foreign to you, which is perfect, because you want to be able to go back in and read it and be like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Or, let me fix this up here. And then you also start to see maybe where the voices bleed over a little bit.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it took many drafts. I mean, I looked on my computer to see, it was like maybe 10 with my agent and then another 7 with my editor. So for me, it takes me such a long time to get that voice in my head so it really feels like a melody, and to be able to recognize the melody, the distinct melody for each piece. It just takes me a long time.
I mean, I think that's helpful for people to hear. It takes me a long time. I think anyone who's publishing, truthfully, who I know, it takes a long time and many drafts. And you think you're done and you're not done.
I know. I mean, every time you're like, this is it, I'm done. Yeah. And then, you have a loving reader that is honest with you and comes back and will tell you the truth, which I'm so grateful for, because it's really great when someone else can see greater heights for what you've set out to do than you see for yourself, That's
true. And while I have you on this moment, let me ask you about Louise DeSalvo and this woman who I think was a mentor to you. Yeah.
Yes. Mentor, friend, just beloved woman. So I studied with her at Hunter College, and she developed and founded the Memoir program there. I studied with her 2009 to 2011. After that, I worked for her as her research assistant for a few years. And then after that, we were, just friends. And it is no exaggeration to say that woman changed my life, breathed life into me. She was the one who I love to tell the story. There's so many Louise stories that I love, but when I entered the program, I had this completely different memoir that I was going to write. And, and it was, about my mother-in-law and integrating, my family with my husband's family. And we were at her house one day, and she said, that story you're writing about the mother-in-law is a fart in a windstorm. And she said, that's not your story. And I said, I have 75 pages that suggest otherwise. And she said, I want you to tell me where you're from. And Cinderland, let me see if I have it here. This is what Cinderland became a very long answer to that question. And she said, excuse my language, but she said, people don't give a shit who you are. You need to tell them where you're from. And
that's a great line.
Yeah. And she had she had so many good one-liners. And so she was the person, just by asking a question. That was all it took from her, is asking the right question, listening to me long enough to know that right question to ask.
Well, I think that another lesson for people listening who don't know Louise personally, but are thinking about their own mentors or even about mentoring, is that she just did not pull any punches at all. She would be very honest with you and rewarding when you got it right, but really pretty darn tough.
Yes. And there was such love behind that toughness, which is why I think, I could weather it. And I remember when Cinderland came out, she took me out to lunch, and I was telling her that, the book had gotten some mixed reception from people that I grew up with, and how difficult that was, and me trying to process that. And she said, if everyone had loved what you wrote, you wouldn't have told the truth. You didn't tell the truth if everybody loved what you wrote. And so she always just had those sort of one-line things that I can still repeat to myself now. And so we just had a really wonderful friendship. What was great about it is that we never stayed in that, we started out as student and teacher, but then it sort of morphed to what I think she'd always wanted it to be, which was friends.
Right.
So
I mean, I think a lot of her students that she really truly cared about ended up that way, and she just had a gift for kind of telling the truth about her life and about and encouraging other people to do the same. One of the things she said, I've talked about this before about her, is that she said, "Don't call it writing, call it work."
Yes,
people value work, and that relates to another question you have here, which is, how did you schedule your writing time when your kids were little? How did you make that work? Yeah.
Yes. Oh my goodness. Such a great question, because I want to say, before I had kids, I was terrified about what was going to happen. Would I have to give up this side of myself? And for whoever's out there and watching, I want you to know that my career, just gained so much breadth and momentum after I became a mother. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't hard. But I just want to offer that as encouragement, because I think it's a little scary to wonder how you're going to, care for the life of your book and the life of your, life's work, but also this other little human life. It's really, it's hard, because I feel like writers love to have a solitary project. And when you think, how do I multitask? I mean, I'm a terrible multitasker. That's why I'm a writer, because I like to do one thing and do it for a long time. So here's what I did. When my son was little, he never slept. It was really difficult. So I figured out, when I knew I could have 15 minutes to 45 minutes, something like that. And then I would have my laptop open and I would get him in his bed or get him in the swing. And then I would have everything ready to go and I would sit down and I would work. And I think what was most important is that I had this running commentary in my head that said, you're never going to finish this. You will never finish this way. And I had to kind of be like, okay, I guess I won't finish it. And then I would just keep typing. And so I think I let that voice kind of coexist and said, okay. And then, it would be one day, 200 words, the next day, 500, the next day, nothing. And then all of a sudden, I had a chunk of pages that I could go back to and work through. So I did have to, because I was used to working in long stretches. When I did Cinderland, I felt like I got really deep with it. And Shiner just couldn't be that way because I have these two little ones who are responsible for me. So a lot of it I did during nap time. And a lot of it was me letting myself despair for a little bit and say, okay, well, even if it doesn't work out, you'll still be glad that you wrote those 200 words. And it does add up over time,
It really does. I think that's a really important point. I always tell my own students that if I had waited for long stretches of time, I would never have written a word, in those busy years when you're raising children and I was teaching, doing all these other things, you have to grab the moments. And just hearing from you about how those added up, really super helpful, I think.
And that's also, I was just gonna say that's what Louise modeled for me, which I think was so important, is that she modeled how to be a parent.
She really did, yeah.
And it wasn't like this thing where it's like all of a sudden a woman has kids and she can't do these other things. And what she said to me, she said, I work in snatches. I'm sitting on the floor with my kid and I've got my notebook out. And so I was like, well, give it a try and see.
It's true. All right. There are two more questions.
Sure.
So let's see if we can get to them. So the book Hillbilly Elegy also centers on the people of Appalachia.
Mm-hmm.
Does your story view the people or community similarly or differently? And in what ways?
So J.D. Vance is he's the author of Hillbilly Elegy. He's actually from a part of Ohio that is not too far from where I'm from. I think that book, because it was published when it was published, it got this huge cloud around it that there's a difference between, I think, what that book came to mean and what the text of that book actually says. So
what's your feeling about the text?
What's my feeling?
Mm-hmm.
I read it and I loved it. I felt like he had such compassion for the people that he wrote about, and that what I got from the story that he wrote was that he said, if it weren't for my grandparents, I never would have been able to, meet these dreams that I had for myself. That's what I got from it. I think that the narrative that surrounded it became something completely different. So I don't quite understand what the disconnect there is.
What do you think the narrative became?
I think the narrative became, because it was published, right around the 2016 election, it sort of became this poster child of why people voted for Trump in Appalachia. And that's just not what I got from it. I mean, but that's not to say that people who are critical of the text or critical of him and his politics, they don't have a say. I think what this whole thing meant to me is that there's not enough representation of different lifestyles and different points of view from Appalachia. I mean, I think what's different from my perspective and his perspective, first of all, his is a memoir, obviously, so there's different things. Mine, I wanted to write about people who don't want to leave home, and that there's something that is very important, and there's pride from this place that you grew up in. And I'm not, knocking J.D. Vance. I just think it's sort of a difference.
That's actually a really important point about your book, because you do settle in to the community in a way without this constant feeling that someone is breaking out. As you read the book, you really feel like you're in it. Oh, can I? The next question because this is our final question, and it's actually on the same point. So
sure.
Kathleen says, I love the setting of Shiner, almost as if Appalachia is its own character. Can you talk more about the research or personal observations that helped you get it right? Love the book.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you. I mean, I think probably the first conversation I had with myself, and if I, were to continue to talk about Hillbilly Elegy, it would be, there is not a real Appalachia if everybody's definition of it is the same. That means, what that means is we have so few stories that are told or given a platform about this region that stories like Hillbilly Elegy start to get stuffed and weighed down by too much meaning and for being some sort of clarion call that it was never meant to be. And that's, I mean, J.D. Vance may not say that. That's just my opinion. I just think we step into dangerous territory when we define real Appalachia as only people who agree with us. And that's me saying somebody who I do not agree with J.D. Vance at all politically. But I still think he wrote a beautiful book and he told his truth. And I think that the story that he wrote and the one that I wrote can coexist and they can be in conversation. And I think there's something in that friction that is really important about the stories that we tell. They are not all the same. We don't experience trauma the same way. We don't experience triumph the same way. So right. I think I was very cognizant of the fact, and that's actually one reason why there's 3 different voices in the novel, is because everybody there lived through the same experience in the same place, and they all have wildly different opinions about what happened. Right. And I think there's something that's true in that says, okay, we're getting at something that if we want to get rid of the word real, that is maybe true, if that makes sense.
I love that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we're ready to wrap it up here.
Okay, yeah, I just want to say thank you to Amy Jo and Christina for being here with us. Thank you to our viewers for coming out. Amy Jo, congratulations. Shiner, here it is. Do you wanna hold it up? There it is. Yeah, there we go. We all got it. So again, you can purchase the book with the green button below, or you can visit our website, midtownscholar.com. Again, free bookmark, book plate. We're hooking you guys up. Again, thank you to our viewers. Thank you, Christina and Amy.
Yes, thank you. This was such an honor. Thank you. Yeah. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Stay safe.
Bye.